Fairfield, Connecticut, April to May 2022. The Harper family embodied everything their suburban community admired. Nestled in a two-story colonial home, with its pristine lawn and white picket fence, they appeared as the quintessential American family. Robert Harper, a successful entrepreneur, provided a life of comfort and stability for his family. Lydia Harper, his wife of 15 years, devoted her days to maintaining the household and raising their daughter, Emily, a bright and perceptive 16-year-old. To the outside world, their lives seemed flawless, a picture of harmony. But beneath this immaculate exterior, fractures were forming. Lydia Harper stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the sink as water ran over a plate. The hum of the dishwasher filled the silence, yet it couldn't drown out the emptiness she felt. Years ago, she had dreams of her own: travel, a career, a life full of possibilities. But those ambitions were quietly set aside when she married Robert. Now, her days were a repetitive cycle of chores and polite smiles, while Robert's attention was consumed by his booming consulting firm. That evening, the routine was the same. Robert arrived late, his briefcase in hand and his phone glued to his ear. He nodded at Lydia in acknowledgement before retreating to his study. The air between them was cordial but cold, devoid of the intimacy that had once defined their relationship. Lydia watched as he disappeared behind the door, a familiar pang of loneliness gripping her chest. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, she called after him. There was no response. In a bedroom upstairs, Emily Harper scrolled through her phone, glancing occasionally at the textbooks sprawled across her desk. She was a sharp observer, attuned to the subtle shifts in her family's dynamics. She noticed her mother's distant stares, the strained smiles exchanged between her parents, and the growing tension that seemed to hang over the house like a cloud. Emily sighed, running a hand through her dark hair. She had always looked up to her mother, a strong, composed woman who seemed to hold their world together. But lately, Lydia seemed distracted, preoccupied with something Emily couldn't quite put her finger on. The monotony of the Harper household was interrupted with the arrival of Marcus Harper, Robert's 24-year-old son from a previous marriage. Marcus had been away for years, first attending college in Boston and later attempting to launch his own startup. His return to Fairfield was unexpected, and his presence stirred a quiet unease within the family. "Welcome home, Marcus," Lydia said warmly as he stepped through the front door, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. She took in his appearance, confident but tired, his brown eyes carrying a restlessness that mirrored her own. "Thanks, Lydia," Marcus replied, his smile charming but guarded. He cast a glance around the house, his expression revealing subtle discomfort. Though the Harper home was now his, he felt more like a visitor than a member of the family. At dinner, the conversation was stilted. Robert, ever the pragmatist, focused on logistics, Marcus's plans for the future, his career prospects, and his intentions now that he was back. The younger Harper answered politely but tersely, clearly uncomfortable under his father's scrutiny. Meanwhile, Lydia observed Marcus closely. Unlike Robert, who seemed to see only what Marcus hadn't accomplished, Lydia noticed the vulnerability hidden behind his confident facade. She sensed the same disconnection in him that she felt in herself. Days turned into weeks, and Marcus's presence slowly became a part of the household rhythm. He spent his days searching for job opportunities and his evenings on the couch, often exchanging casual conversation with Lydia. At first, their interactions were polite and surface level. But as the weeks went by, the tone of their conversations shifted. One afternoon, Marcus found Lydia in the garden, tending to her roses. He leaned against the wooden fence, watching her work. "Your roses look amazing," he said, breaking the silence. Lydia glanced up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Thank you. It's my little escape, I guess. Something to take my mind off everything else." Marcus nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I get that. It's hard to find something grounding when everything else feels out of control." His words struck a chord. Lydia paused, the pruning shears in her hand hovering mid-air. "You're too young to feel that way," she said softly. "And yet, here I am," Marcus replied, his tone laced with irony. It was a small moment, one that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But for Lydia, it was significant. For the first time in years, someone seemed to understand her. The walls she had carefully constructed around her emotions began to crack. Emily, from her vantage point, began to notice subtle changes. Her mother seemed lighter, more animated in her interactions with Marcus. The quiet tension that had marked their household for years was now replaced by a different kind of unease, one she couldn't yet define but instinctively distrusted. As spring unfolded, so did the undercurrents of something far more dangerous. Lydia and Marcus continued to find themselves drawn into conversations that lasted longer and became increasingly personal. What had started as innocent connections between a stepmother and her stepson began to take on an edge, one that neither fully acknowledged but both felt. The perfect facade of the Harper family was beginning to crack. And soon, those cracks would lead to something irreparable. Fairfield, Connecticut, June 2022. Summer had arrived in Fairfield, and with it came the oppressive heat that seemed to cling to the air, heavy and stifling. The Harper household, once filled with an artificial calm, now carried a strange tension. Emily Harper could feel it as clearly as the heat on her skin. Something wasn't right. Emily had always been perceptive, a natural observer who could pick up on the smallest shifts in the atmosphere around her. Lately, her mother, Lydia, had seemed different, distracted, more animated in ways that didn't quite feel natural. Lydia's laughter, especially when Marcus was around, sounded forced, too eager. The quiet moments they shared on the porch or in the garden had started to feel less familial and more secretive. It was during one of these moments that Emily first noticed the way Marcus looked at Lydia. It wasn't obvious, but it was enough to send a faint chill down her spine. His gaze lingered too long, his smile too intimate. Emily brushed the thought aside, convincing herself she was reading too much into things. After all, Marcus was her stepbrother, and Lydia was her mother. The idea was absurd. But as the days passed, the signs became harder to ignore. One sweltering afternoon, Emily sat in the living room, pretending to scroll through her phone while keeping an eye on Lydia and Marcus. They were sitting at the kitchen table, their heads bowed in conversation. From Emily's vantage point, she couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way they leaned toward each other made her stomach tighten. Lydia laughed softly, her hand brushing Marcus's arm, and he didn't pull away. Emily clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Something about their body language felt wrong, even if she couldn't explain why. "Emily," Lydia called, breaking her thoughts. "Do you mind grabbing some lemonade from the fridge?" "Sure," Emily replied, her voice tight. She rose from the couch, shooting a quick glance at the two of them as she passed. They fell silent, exchanging a glance that only deepened Emily's unease. That evening, the tension in Emily's chest grew unbearable. She replayed the moments she had seen over the past few weeks, Lydia's sudden absences, the hushed conversations, and Marcus's overly familiar demeanor. She couldn't shake the feeling that her mother was hiding something, and Emily's curiosity began to border on suspicion. Late that night, as the house settled into stillness, Emily lay awake in her bed. The faint glow of her phone illuminated her face as she scrolled mindlessly, trying to distract herself. Her mother's phone, left charging in the kitchen, kept nagging at the back of her mind. Emily's conscience wrestled with her curiosity, but the unanswered questions gnawed at her until she couldn't resist any longer. Slipping out of bed, she crept downstairs, careful not to make a sound. The kitchen was bathed in moonlight, and Lydia's phone sat innocuously on the counter. Emily hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, before reaching for it. The screen lit up, revealing a string of notifications. Emily swiped through them, scrolling until her fingers froze. There, in the messages, was a conversation with Marcus. The texts were innocuous at first, brief exchanges about household chores or errands. But as Emily scrolled further, her stomach dropped. The tone of the messages shifted, becoming more personal, more intimate. Marcus, I can't stop thinking about last night. You looked amazing. Lydia, you always know what to say. You make me feel alive again. Emily's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she continued reading. The texts became more explicit, peppered with plans for secret meetings and references to moments they'd shared. Her mother had saved pictures too, selfies of Lydia looking radiant, clearly taken for Marcus's eyes alone. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was confirmation. Emily stumbled back from the counter, her mind reeling. Her throat tightened, and tears burned in her eyes as she tried to process what she'd just uncovered. The betrayal cut deeper than she could have imagined. It wasn't just that her mother had been unfaithful, it was that Lydia had chosen Marcus, someone who should have been family. Emily gripped the edge of the counter, fighting to steady herself. Her mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Did her father suspect anything? What would happen if he found out? What should she do? The next morning, Emily could barely look at Lydia or Marcus without feeling a wave of nausea. Lydia, oblivious to her daughter's discovery, carried on as usual, her cheerful demeanor now feeling painfully fake. Marcus, too, seemed unbothered, his charm masking whatever guilt he might have felt. Emily's anger simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. She avoided both of them as much as possible, retreating to her room or leaving the house altogether. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the weight of what she knew. A few days later, Emily cornered Lydia in the living room while Robert was out. Her mother looked up from her book, startled by the intensity in her daughter's expression. "What's wrong, Emily?" Lydia asked, setting the book aside. Emily hesitated, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "I know about you and Marcus." The color drained from Lydia's face. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. "Don't lie to me," Emily shouted, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I saw the messages. I saw the pictures." Lydia's composure crumbled. She reached for Emily, but her daughter recoiled, her voice rising. "How could you? He's my stepbrother. Dad's son. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" Lydia's denial quickly turned to desperation. "Emily, please, you don't understand. It's not what you think. Don't treat me like I'm stupid." Emily spat. "You betrayed Dad. You betrayed all of us." The confrontation ended with Emily storming upstairs, slamming her door behind her. Lydia sat frozen on the couch, her mind spinning with fear. Her secret wasn't safe anymore, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. New Haven, Connecticut, August 2022. The cabin sat nestled in the dense woods outside New Haven, abandoned and forgotten by all but the Harper family. Years ago, it had been a retreat, a place for lazy summer afternoons and quiet holidays. Now, its broken shutters and peeling paint gave it a forlorn, almost eerie quality. It was the perfect place for secrets to unravel. Lydia Harper arrived first, her heart pounding as she paced the dusty wooden floorboards. The air inside was stifling, the summer heat trapped within the cabin's decaying walls. She wiped her palms on her jeans, clutching her phone tightly in one hand. She had convinced Marcus to meet her here, framing the request as one final conversation to clear the air. But her true intentions ran far deeper. She wasn't ready to let him go. Marcus pulled up minutes later, parking his car at the edge of the dirt trail that led to the cabin. He hesitated before stepping out, his jaw tight with resolve. He didn't want to be here. For weeks, the weight of their secret had pressed down on him like a stone. He had tried to create distance, ignoring Lydia's calls, keeping their interactions brief. But Lydia had been persistent, her desperation palpable. Against his better judgment, he had agreed to this meeting. As he approached the cabin, the crunch of gravel under his boots felt deafening in the oppressive silence of the woods. The sight of Lydia waiting for him inside, her face lit with a mixture of hope and fear, made his stomach turn. "You came," Lydia said, her voice trembling as she moved toward him. Marcus nodded curtly, closing the door behind him. "Let's get this over with." The conversation began tense but civil. Marcus stood with his arms crossed, keeping his distance as Lydia pleaded with him to reconsider. Her words tumbled out in a rush, a mix of apologies, promises, and half-choked sobs. "We can figure this out," she said, stepping closer. "We don't have to end it like this." "You mean everything to me, Marcus." Marcus shook his head, his voice firm. "Lydia, this has to stop. It's already gone too far. If anyone finds out..." "No one will find out." Lydia interrupted, her tone rising. "I've been careful. We've been careful." "Careful?" Marcus snapped, his frustration boiling over. "Emily already knows, Lydia. Do you have any idea what kind of mess this is going to create? For you? For me? For Dad?" The mention of Emily made Lydia falter. Her mind raced, panic creeping into her voice. "She won't say anything. I'll talk to her. I'll fix it." "You can't fix this," Marcus said coldly. "It's broken. We're broken." The finality in his tone sent a shiver through Lydia. She reached out, grabbing his arm, her grip tighter than she intended. "Please, Marcus. Don't do this. I can't," her voice cracked. "I can't lose you." Marcus pulled his arm away, his expression hardening. "You have to let me go, Lydia. This isn't love. It's a mistake." The words hit her like a slap. Lydia's chest heaved as a mix of heartbreak and fury surged through her. She had given everything to Marcus, her trust, her vulnerability, her heart. And now, he was abandoning her, leaving her to face the wreckage of their choices alone. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You don't get to walk away. Not after everything." Marcus turned to leave, his hand reaching for the door. "Goodbye, Lydia." In a blind panic, Lydia lunged for the bag she had brought with her. Her trembling hands closed around the handle of the knife she'd packed earlier that day. She had told herself it was for protection, but deep down, she knew it had been for this moment. "Don't you dare walk away from me," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. Marcus froze, turning back to see Lydia standing there, the blade gleaming in the dim light. His eyes widened, a mixture of shock and disbelief washing over his face. "Lydia," he said slowly, raising his hands, "put that down. You don't want to do this." Her grip tightened on the knife. "You don't understand. If you leave, my life is over. You're all I have left." "That's not true," Marcus said, taking a cautious step toward her. "You still have your family, your daughter." "Don't talk to me about my family," Lydia shouted, her voice breaking. "They don't care about me. You're the only one who ever did." The confrontation escalated rapidly. Marcus tried to reason with her, his voice calm but edged with urgency. Lydia, consumed by her spiraling emotions, couldn't hear him. Her movements became erratic, the knife trembling in her hands as she blocked his path to the door. "Lydia, stop this," Marcus pleaded. "We can fix this, but not like this." "Fix it?" Lydia's laugh was hollow, almost manic. "You think you can fix this by leaving me? By throwing me away like I'm nothing?" In the heat of the moment, Marcus made a sudden move, trying to disarm her. The struggle was chaotic, shouts echoing off the cabin walls, the sharp sound of furniture toppling over, and the metallic clang of the knife falling to the floor. But in the chaos, Lydia's desperation gave way to a surge of rage. She grabbed the knife again, and before either of them could process what was happening, the blade struck. Marcus staggered backward, his hands clutching his side as crimson bloomed across his shirt. He looked at Lydia, his eyes wide with pain and disbelief. "Lydia," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper before he collapsed to the floor. For a moment, the cabin was silent, save for Lydia's ragged breathing. She stared at Marcus's motionless body, the knife slipping from her bloodied hands. The reality of what she had done crashed over her like a wave, leaving her paralyzed with shock and horror. The place that had once been a sanctuary for stolen moments now reeked of violence and despair. And for Lydia, there was no going back. The cabin felt suffocating. The once silent walls now bore witness to the irreversible. Lydia Harper stood frozen, her breath hitching as she stared at Marcus's lifeless body sprawled across the wooden floor. Blood seeped from his side, pooling around him and staining the dusty floorboards. The metallic scent was overwhelming, mingling with the lingering summer heat. Lydia's mind raced, a torrent of shock, regret, and primal fear crashing over her. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. For a moment, Lydia stood paralyzed, her hands trembling and slick with blood. Then, survival instinct took over. Her breaths came quick and shallow as she scanned the room, calculating her next move. The knife lay discarded on the floor, glinting in the dim light. She picked it up, gripping the handle tightly as her thoughts blurred together. No one can know. I have to fix this. Her first priority was to remove any trace that could tie her to the crime. She stumbled to her bag, pulling out the towel she'd brought for what she had pretended would be a picnic. With trembling hands, she wiped the knife clean, erasing the fingerprints. She then scanned the room, looking for any other evidence she might have left behind. Her gaze returned to Marcus. The sight of his pale face, his glassy eyes staring into nothingness, sent a jolt through her. A sob caught in her throat, but she pushed it down. Grief and guilt could wait. For now, there was only the cold logic of covering her tracks. She grabbed Marcus's phone from his pocket, quickly deleting their messages. Photos, texts, anything that could hint at their relationship, gone. Lydia worked methodically, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the device. Once finished, she flung the phone into the fireplace, shattering the screen against the iron grate. The next step was the body. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she assessed the situation. The cabin was too conspicuous, too close to the hiking trail. Someone might find him here. She needed to move him somewhere remote, somewhere it could look like an accident. She spotted the tarp hanging over a pile of old firewood and seized it, dragging it to where Marcus lay. Her movements were clumsy, and she winced with every noise, terrified that someone might hear her. Wrapping Marcus's body in the tarp was a gruesome task. Her hands slipped on the blood-soaked fabric, and her arms ached as she struggled to maneuver his dead weight. By the time she finished, sweat dripped down her forehead, mixing with tears she refused to let fall. This wasn't the time for breaking down. Not yet. Dragging the tarp across the forest floor was even harder. The weight of Marcus's body made every step excruciating, the rough terrain catching at her shoes and the edge of the tarp. Branches scraped her arms, and the faint hoot of an owl in the distance sent her heart racing. After what felt like an eternity, she reached the ravine. It was a steep drop, surrounded by dense foliage, isolated enough to ensure that no one would find him for days, maybe weeks. She stood at the edge, staring down at the rocky ground below. Her breath hitched as she whispered, "I'm sorry, Marcus," before giving the tarp one final shove. The sound of the body tumbling down the ravine echoed through the still night. Lydia stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness, her chest heaving as the enormity of what she'd done began to settle in. By the time Lydia returned to the cabin, dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon, casting a pale light over the scene. She hurried to clean up the remaining evidence, the bloodstains on the floor, the scuff marks left from dragging Marcus's body. She worked until her arms ached, scrubbing frantically, though she knew she couldn't erase everything. Satisfied that the cabin no longer held any obvious clues, she grabbed her bag and left, her steps unsteady as she made her way back to the car. Her mind raced as she rehearsed her alibi. She had been home all night, she told herself. No one would question her. She was Lydia Harper, the perfect wife and mother. Who would ever suspect her of something like this? 3 days later, a group of hikers found Marcus's body in the ravine. The scene was grisly, his injuries suggesting a fall from the steep cliffs above. They called the police, who quickly arrived to secure the area. By the afternoon, the news had spread, and Robert received the devastating call: his son was dead. Lydia feigned shock and grief as Robert broke the news. She clutched his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face, though her mind was elsewhere. Had she left anything behind? Would they find the knife? The blood? Every knock on the door made her flinch, convinced it was the police coming to arrest her. The New Haven Police Department launched an investigation into Marcus's death. At first glance, it appeared to be a tragic accident, perhaps he had slipped while hiking. But inconsistencies began to emerge. The angle of the injuries didn't align with a simple fall. Nearby, officers found faint drag marks leading to the edge of the ravine. Detectives interviewed the Harpers as part of their standard procedure. Lydia kept her answers measured, her demeanor sorrowful but composed. "I hadn't seen Marcus since he left for a walk that afternoon," she said, her voice trembling convincingly. "He needed time to clear his head." Emily, meanwhile, watched her mother carefully, her own suspicions growing. Lydia's feigned grief felt hollow, and Emily couldn't ignore the memory of the blood-stained shirt she'd found hidden in the laundry 2 days earlier. As the investigation deepened, the police uncovered discrepancies in Lydia's timeline. Her phone records showed gaps in activity, and a missing hour that couldn't be accounted for. More troubling, Marcus's deleted messages hinted at a relationship that went beyond what was appropriate. Emily's unease grew unbearable. She knew her mother was hiding something, and she had the evidence to prove it. But could she really betray her own mother? Could she live with the consequences if she didn't? The weight of the secret pressed down on her, threatening to crush her entirely. The Harper family's facade of normalcy was crumbling, and the truth was closing in. Lydia could feel it like a noose tightening around her neck. New Haven, Connecticut, November 2022. The courthouse buzzed with tension, its hallways crowded with journalists, curious onlookers, and those seeking closure for the tragic death of Marcus Harper. The trial of Lydia Harper had become a media sensation, with headlines plastered across every major outlet. Words like affair, betrayal, and murder screamed from the front pages, casting the Harper family into the harsh spotlight of public scrutiny. Inside the courtroom, Lydia sat at the defense table, her once pristine composure now replaced by a hollowed-out weariness. Her lawyer, Thomas Reed, whispered instructions to her as she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Across the room, Robert and Emily Harper sat in the gallery, their faces a mixture of grief and disbelief. Emily avoided her mother's gaze, her stomach twisting with the weight of her testimony to come. The state's attorney wasted no time painting Lydia as a manipulative and calculating woman who had allowed her desires to spiral into obsession, and ultimately, murder. The prosecution called witness after witness, building a narrative that was damning and meticulous. The lead detective testified about the evidence found at the scene, from the drag marks near the ravine to Lydia's DNA on Marcus's clothing. Forensic experts detailed the angle of Marcus's injuries, which suggested he had been pushed or dragged, rather than falling accidentally. The most devastating piece of evidence came in the form of the recovered text messages between Lydia and Marcus. Although many had been deleted, forensic analysts were able to retrieve fragments that revealed the true nature of their relationship. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor read aloud messages that hinted at an affair, texts filled with longing, desperation, and the final arguments leading up to Marcus's death. "You can't leave me," the prosecutor read, his voice cold and deliberate. "I need you." These were the words Lydia Harper sent to Marcus Harper the night before his death. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this was not a woman in distress, this was a woman in control. When Emily Harper was called to the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. Her testimony had been widely anticipated, not only for its content but for the moral dilemma it presented. A daughter testifying against her mother, against the woman who had raised her. Emily's hands shook as she adjusted the microphone, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Emily," the prosecutor began gently, "can you describe what you found on your mother's phone the night of June 28th? Emily's voice was barely above a whisper, but each word struck like a hammer. She recounted the texts, the photos, and the sense of betrayal that had overwhelmed her. Tears streamed down her face as she described the confrontation with her mother, Lydia's desperate denials, and her own growing suspicion in the weeks that followed. "Did you find anything else that raised concerns?" the prosecutor asked. Emily hesitated, her voice trembling. "A shirt," she said. "I found it in the laundry. It had blood on it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Lydia's head dropped into her hands as Emily continued, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to believe it. But after everything else, I knew." When the defense had their turn, Thomas Reed approached Emily with a calculated gentleness. "Emily, you've described a strained relationship with your mother in recent months. Is it possible your emotions clouded your judgment? That you misinterpreted what you found?" Emily's response was steady, though her voice was heavy with pain. "No," she said firmly. "I know what I saw. And I know what she did." Thomas Reed presented Lydia as a woman overcome by emotional distress, spiraling under the weight of her deteriorating marriage and the complex dynamics of her family. Psychological experts testified that Lydia suffered from depression and anxiety, conditions exacerbated by feelings of isolation and neglect. They argued that her actions were not premeditated but the result of a mental breakdown. Character witnesses, including a neighbor and a longtime family friend, described Lydia as a devoted mother and wife who had lost her way. "She was always the glue of this family," one neighbor said tearfully. "Whatever happened, it wasn't who she really is." Lydia herself took the stand, her voice wavering as she described the months leading up to Marcus's death. "I wasn't thinking clearly," she said, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the witness box. I loved him, but not the way you think. He was my family. I didn't mean to hurt him." But the prosecutor's cross-examination dismantled her claims. "If this was not premeditated," he asked, his voice sharp, "why did you bring a knife to the cabin that day?" Lydia faltered, her words unraveling into incoherent denials. The courtroom felt electric with tension as the prosecutor pressed on, leaving her visibly shaken. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The foreperson's voice was steady as they announced, "We find the defendant, Lydia Harper, guilty of second-degree murder." Lydia's shoulders sagged, her face crumpling as the weight of the words sank in. Robert stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable, while Emily silently wept beside him. The judge sentenced Lydia to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. In the weeks following the trial, the Harper family's lives were irrevocably changed. Robert filed for divorce, retreating into his work to avoid confronting the pain. Emily, racked with guilt, struggled to move on, haunted by memories of the mother she once knew. Lydia, now confined to a cell, spent her days replaying every moment that had led to her downfall. She wrote letters to Emily and Robert, begging for forgiveness, though she knew it might never come. The media eventually moved on to other scandals, but for the Harpers, the scars remained. Emily enrolled in therapy, determined to rebuild her life. Robert sold the house in Fairfield, unable to bear the memories it held. Though the world outside continued to turn, for the Harpers, time seemed frozen, an eternal reminder of what had been lost in those fateful months. The tragedy of the Harper family became more than a sensational headline. It was a cautionary tale about the consequences of unspoken pain, unchecked desires, and the fragile nature of trust. Fairfield, Connecticut, December 2022. The first snow of the season blanketed Fairfield in a deceptive calm. The Harper house, now empty and listed for sale, stood as a hollow shell of the family that once inhabited it. The laughter and love that had echoed within its walls had been replaced by an eerie silence, a reminder of the fractures that could never be mended. In a small, stark prison cell miles away, Lydia sat at her desk, her hands clutching a pen as she scribbled furiously into a notebook. Letters to Emily, letters to Robert, pleas for understanding, apologies, and expressions of love poured from her pen. But as the pages piled up, so too did her doubt. Would Emily even read them? Would Robert ever forgive her? The weight of her actions was inescapable. The memories of that night at the cabin haunted her dreams, the look in Marcus's eyes as life slipped away burned into her mind. Each day in prison was a penance, a stark reminder of the moment her life unraveled. But beneath the guilt, a small, desperate hope lingered. Perhaps, one day, Emily would come to see her, not as a monster but as a mother who had lost her way. It was the only thread of light in her otherwise dark existence. Emily sat alone in her dorm room at a nearby college, staring out the window at the snow-covered campus. She had thrown herself into her studies, using academic pressure as a way to escape the chaos that had consumed her life. But no amount of distraction could erase the ache in her chest or the vivid memories of her mother's trial. Her therapist had encouraged her to write about her feelings, to process the whirlwind of betrayal, grief, and guilt. But every time Emily tried, the words felt hollow. How could she put into words the pain of testifying against her own mother? The conflict of wanting to protect her family while knowing the truth had to come out? Still, Emily held on to a fragile sense of hope. She believed that with time, and a lot of effort, she might heal. But she also knew the scars Lydia had left on her family would never fully fade. For Robert, the months following Lydia's conviction were a blur. He had sold the house and moved into a modest apartment in New Haven, far from the memories that haunted him. His once vibrant confidence was replaced by a quiet resignation. He avoided the media, ignored the whispers from colleagues, and buried himself in work. But the loss of Marcus weighed heavily on him. Though their relationship had always been strained, Marcus was still his son. The knowledge that Robert had missed the signs, of Marcus's struggles, of Lydia's betrayal, gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed his family, that his relentless focus on his career had left cracks for disaster to seep through. The Harper tragedy lingered in Fairfield's collective consciousness. Neighbors whispered about the family whenever they passed the empty house. The scandal had become a cautionary tale, a grim reminder that even the most picture-perfect families could harbor dark secrets. The media coverage waned, replaced by fresher stories of intrigue and tragedy. But for those who had followed the trial closely, the Harper case left an indelible mark. It sparked debates about morality, family dynamics, and the consequences of unchecked emotional turmoil. The Harper family's story wasn't just about betrayal and loss. Beneath the tragedy lay important lessons about communication, trust, and the dangers of unspoken pain. Lydia's spiral into despair and Marcus's desperate need for validation were symptoms of a deeper problem, a family unable to connect with each other on a meaningful level. Emily often thought about what might have been different if someone had spoken up sooner. If Robert had noticed Lydia's unhappiness, if Lydia had sought help for her growing dissatisfaction, or if Marcus had confided in someone about his struggles, could they have avoided the disaster that tore them apart? The snow continued to fall over Fairfield, covering the Harper house in a pristine white sheet. But beneath the snow, the foundation remained cracked, the wounds of the past buried but not forgotten. For the Harpers, life would go on, but it would never be the same. Their story would live on, not just as a scandal but as a reminder of the fragility of family bonds, and the resilience required to rebuild them. What do you think about Lydia's actions? Was her sentence justified, or do you believe her mental state should have been weighed more heavily? Do you think Emily made the right decision in testifying against her mother, or could she have handled it differently? What could the Harper family have done to prevent this tragedy? Could better communication or seeking help have changed the outcome? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions in the comments below. Let's discuss this gripping and emotional story together.